A reading from Miss MacIntosh, My Darling, by Marguerite Young. Chapter 28. His faithfulness drew him each evening here as to a brilliant star, yet though he had outlived himself, he was having, he believed, except for these enchanted evenings in a nightmarish world of my mother's narcotic dreams, little sense as to the immediacy of his own corporeal reality, the vastness of this trembling flesh enclosing his feeble spirit like a flame. He might well have been, he must admit, among my mother's irresponsible hallucinations, only another of the luminous and metamorphic dead she entertained, a bearded Russian bishop, or an iridescent lighthouse keeper, perhaps the Antarctic Queen Maud Mountains, with her snow-capped mountain peaks and white umbrellas and lace capes, and great snow owls with horn-rimmed spectacles and human faces, perhaps Queen Charlotte Islands in a storm, or a moon-faced duchess with rustling silken skirts, and many brown-eyed lapdogs barking, many music boxes tinkling old-fashioned waltzes, many astral voices, bird cries, insect whirrings, perhaps the headless horseman fording a brook, the flowers turning into serpents. For all his life, in a personal sense, it seemed to him, except for his delusive evenings here, had been a dark and empty plain, and only here, where he was still denied and turned away, he was still renewed, perhaps by my mother's obtuse faith that he would always return, he with his hesitant smile, smiling at him because he smiled, his unchanging ways. It was only problematical, however, his life which he had precariously lived, and it was also problematical, that spindle of creative flame which is said to sleep in the eternal darkness, weaving our bodies, weaving our separate souls, weaving the clothing of our dreams, weaving the nakedness. He was this living ghost whose terrible flesh belied, he believed, his late death or his brother's early death, and so his problems of being were greater than he knew, even as were his more comprehensive problems of non-being. How should he know the actual man he was? How should his brother know? His brother would never return, never in this individual life, Mr. Spitzer knew, for the dead did not return except in our thoughts. His brother, his face veiled, would not be born again, even should there be the darkest clouds and whirlwinds, vortexes, stars out of their places, deserts suddenly flowering. Even in this drugged atmosphere, there were things not possible, or they were possible through the deceived memory of the unknown. He remembered his dead brother with an increasing vivacity when he had forgotten himself and most of his subdued enthusiasms, the meditative pursuits he once had passionately loved, just as his loud-mouthed brother, having no foresight, no patience to wait for the caterpillar to become the butterfly, or for the rose to become the star, had loved the cruelty of actual life, which was enough for him, or so it had seemed. It had seemed that he had given no thought to a future life, that the present hour or moment had sufficed, whereas Mr. Spitzer had thought only of the impossible future. Mr. Spitzer, search through memory's dim corridors and lanes though he would, had no vivid recollection that he, of himself, had ever deliberately sought, until after his twin brother's untimely death, the heterogeneous crowds, the motley crew, and he was still, he believed, this serene gentleman who, if left to his own choices, preferred his isolation and the darkness, though he came to see my mother and sit by her bedside as if he were drawn by the bright lights. Here, where were these wandering shadows? For he still remembered her, he would explain, much as she had been in his youth. And here, where there were these spiritual derangements, he found his only sense of his unbroken continuity in life, perhaps because no chair had changed its place for years, and there were these ethereal gleamings of gold and silver and watered silk and fluted ivory, as of the great shell of Venus, these intricately woven bell ropes, these bells which gave off a booming sound, like that of the loud sea bittern, these candle flames reflected in dark Venetian mirrors, these semi-faces staring from the ceiling and from the floor. He had even given up 2 or 3 years after his brother's irrational death, which had divided and subdivided his own rational soul almost to the point of lunacy, that favorite pursuit which, during his brother's incalculable life, had often consoled him in the midst of his absolute or his tentative loneliness, his collecting, like emblems of each shining moment, beautiful butterflies of every coloration and kind, of every description and impression, of every realm, the Hesperides, like spirit messengers, tenants of air, tenants of earth, winged flowers, gossamer wings reflecting many prismatic lights, brimstone-colored butterflies burning like torpid flames in the wind, bejeweled butterflies as precious to him as the most precious jewels, or mosaic emperors, or bits of colored glass my mother at least imagined were hers, more precious than the cuckoo singing as it flies, the warblers and the babblers she thought she heard, the griffins flying over the rooftops, the imaginary house guests, the imaginary sea bishops with mitre-shaped heads and vestments of silver scales, the long-limbed and heron-footed citizens walking in the cool of the evening shade, the pagodas moving on the waves, the swan weathercocks lifting their wings in the winds, and the empty paddocks and the drowned gardens, and the mermaids feeding their infants at their breasts, the milk-white unicorn, enclosed by a picket fence, all these beauties, which he could no more see than if he were a mole under the ground, and which my mother saw, even when her eyes were closed, and yet he had cared as much for his ephemeral butterflies as she had cared for things invisible made visible to her, or as his dead twin brother had cared for the wastrel wheels of chance, the games of loaded dice, the croupiers, the billiard hall artists, the macabre clowns, the drugged horses, the swift horses, the harlequins, the painted ladies fluttering through the darkness of the night, which had held no mysteries for him. Of course, Mr. Spitzer's impersonal passion had been expensive, a great toll upon his system. He had had to carry on, for one thing, a large correspondence with other meditative butterfly hunters, this correspondence requiring a considerable outlay for stamps and envelopes, even distracting him from his silent music, and he and he had had to do much research of a delicate nature, such as thoughtless Perron would most certainly have scorned. Perron would most certainly have seen no value, no unearthly significance as to butterflies or any other spirits. As for himself, Mr. Spitzer had not added to his butterfly collection now for many years, needless to say, and many other things had come to an end on the day of Perron's devastating funeral, including, of course, his own capacious heart, the living heart, his way of life or most of it, the important part, yet though he had contrived to continue here, colorless as he had always been and of few personal interests, though still occasionally remembering, when his memory of his brother grew dim, the phenomenal world of the butterfly in all its elusive manifestations, seas of twinkling yellow flowers and clouds of yellow butterflies like flowers floating in the pale morning air. And why should he not remember, for his own sake, these almost incorporeal butterflies? What harm could he possibly do to anyone by his present butterfly memories and thoughts? Sometimes the butterfly, perching upon the flower, had seemed as identical to the flower as twin to twin, and the flower had seemed to fly away, and the winged petals had remained, much to his bewilderment. Perron's interest, unlike his own, had been many and mundane, Perron having cared, or so it had seemed before his death by accident or suicide, for no theory of a life beyond this life, no afterlife, nor could he have wasted his precious moments watching the amazed birth of a butterfly, the first tremblings of the feeble, dew-lit wings, as they unfolded, or watching the last tremblings, the death, the expiration. The manifestations of birth and death were the same in this realm. Indeed, if one watched at only a certain moment, if one were suddenly called away in the midst of these proceedings, one should never know whether it was death or birth, beginning or end, as Mr. Spitzer would sometimes say, plucking at his almost invisible feathery mustache, or consulting his bejeweled wristwatch, to see if there was time for his sporadic butterfly memories which, though for years quiescent in his mind, he still enjoyed. It was an early experience, such as this ambiguity, which had caused him first to embark upon his studies of impalpable butterflies.